Welcome to another edition of Vigorously with me, Val Hands, keeping the metal alive on this podcast with metal content creator Jasper De Man. Belgian Jasper is in the building. I am thrilled to have you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
I got into your content purely through YouTube, really. I think it was the interview that you did with Vicovi because I just did an interview with Vicovi, and
Okay.
I was watching to see like how ours compared or differed at all, and for the most part they were pretty similar, and I really enjoyed yours, so I just clicked around and watched a bunch of yours, and I was like, I gotta have this guy on the show. So, what was the beginning of you interviewing rock stars? How did that even start?
I mean, it was definitely not planned, like many of these things go. Quite simple, to be honest. The world went on lockdown, and everybody had this urge to do something that felt more fulfilling than whatever people were doing.
Mm.
Now, I was in the luxury position that I was, my day job was not impacted by COVID or what have you. I know a lot of people, were forced to stay at home or lost their jobs. I was not in that position, luckily, but nevertheless, I still had that feeling of I mean, I enjoy my job, or I enjoyed my job at that time, um, but it's not necessarily my passion. And, a
Mm.
lot of people are trying to figure out stuff that was more meaningful because especially in the beginning of COVID, in those early, I call them the slumber party days of COVID when everybody's like, yeah, we can do this. We can all be remote and we can do, what was it? House party app, parties. And everybody was all of
Yeah.
a sudden on Zoom and, we're having, drinks together on St. Patty's Day and all that kind of good stuff. People start to realize that this really is a life-changing moment. And for a lot of people, it's like a wake-up call, I think, to go like, you know what, if I'm gonna do something with my time, I want to do something that matters to me. And so I've always been really into any kind of rock music, heavy metal, punk, hardcore, what have you. But I'm not a musician. I own a guitar. It never made it across the pond. I was born in Belgium, born and raised, moved to Canada. I'm not a musician, but I had this passion, it had to come out somehow. So I started doing, figured, you know what, I'm gonna, start a YouTube channel just to make some videos about, this particular genre of metal, like what you
Hmm.
need to know about it, or the classic album stuff like that. Me and my buddies were already always talking about that stuff anyway. I was always making
Yep.
playlists and what have you. And so I started making a few, videos like that. And a few weeks in, I was like, oh, I've got a couple of friends in bands. Maybe that would be a fun. I was just figuring out what do I want to do with this channel. I didn't really know. All I knew that was had to be about metal. And so I interviewed a buddy of mine that was in a deathcore band, and a lot of people, more people reacted to that particular video. And to be fair, this is not, I've not blown up at that point or what have you. These were still very much my friends and family watching these videos. But most people were like, oh, you know, that was really cool to hear you talk to somebody and ask questions to somebody in the band. So do more of that. And then it kind of went from there. And, fast forward a couple of months, it's all I'm doing, well, I mean, these days I'm 4 years later, but I still throw in once in a while like a different video, but my content now is like 99% interviews, and it has become a lot more professional. It's with a proper schedule, working with the right teams and the labels and what have you. So, but that's kind of how it, happened by accident, if you will.
I love that. I have a similar story too. I mean, because I got bored in the middle of the pandemic too. I was doing radio before and I quit
Right.
the industry. And then I quit the industry just to get like a something with a better schedule and better pay to keep it 1,000 with you. Really. And then I fell into this like in the middle of pandemic boredom. And I said, I miss broadcasting. So I want to give myself another outlet. Ta-da.
Right.
This is how to do it. And I love that you turned in essentially what every metalhead does and just turned it into this is like the YouTube form of that. We're all talking about subgenres amongst our friends, talking about what shows we've been to. We're talking about what albums we're into, which one's the best, which one's the worst, which one,
Exactly.
it met expectations and which one didn't. You've turned your channel into a form of that. And I absolutely love to see it. So, of all the interviews that you've done, who were you most excited to speak to?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, I have interviewed some some bands that I was legit a big fan of growing up. Um, uh, but then some bands, I mean, sometimes it's more exciting to interview a band that you don't know that you,
Mm.
until 30 minutes before the interview, you may have not even heard their music. I don't know if you're familiar with a Swedish power metal band. Well, they would say they're a heavy metal band called Hammerfall.
Of
And they
course,
came.
yes.
There you go. Good. So Hammerfall. I mean, they're not the biggest band in metal. They're definitely not the biggest band that I've interviewed. But when I was like, 15, 16 years old in the mid 90s, that's when that band really, kind of came out. And it was the return for people that are deep into metal, European metal. That was kind of like the return of classic heavy metal that
I
withered
see.
away in the early 90s. And so in Europe, when although on the radio and in North America, you would have a lot of, you have groove metal and new metal and hard rock and alternative rock, and this is this is the era of the Load albums, right? Which it's all cool, but all of a sudden, there's these bands popping up in Europe or that are getting traction again that introduce kids like myself who were listening to Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park to a guitar solo and
Right.
to, leather jackets and long hair and, songs about slaying dragons. And that was just not a thing anymore in the mid 90s. So when you're 15, 16 years old, that was perfect, right? So I just fell in love
Right.
with that band. And it was one of those bands. I have a few of those where um, if they're playing, I'll go see them if it's somewhat, feasible. If they put out an album, regardless of what reviews say, I will get that album and stuff like that. And so Hammerfall was one of those bands in the early days for me. And when I finally got to interview, I've interviewed them now a few times, but when I had the first time to interview it, that was like, it was hard to control the fanboy. And
It
so,
can be.
yeah, I know
It
for sure, for sure.
it can be very hard. I've been in that position too. I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna talk to Michael Lickerfeld of Opeth. Holy
There
shit.
you go.
Could not
Yeah, yeah,
like
exactly.
that was the one like for me.
Yeah,
And really just honestly anybody. You start to do this enough times, you start to understand their schedule and how much they've got going on in the middle of their album cycles or their touring cycles and you're like, "Whoa, they made time for me." People don't look at it that way either. They're
for
very
sure,
busy.
for sure,
So
for
you're
sure.
so
Oh yeah, I know for
appreciative.
sure, for sure, for sure. There's I mean, I'm lucky now that I'm in a spot where I have to say like no to 90% of pitches of PR teams, but
Oh,
I'm
really?
still but I'm still getting a lot of no's of bands that I'm trying to get to as well, right? And whenever those bands do say yes, that's always extremely appreciated, and it grounds you. And when it happens with a band that you were a big fan of as a kid, that you know, I recently it's not out yet. I haven't published it yet, but I recently interviewed Christina Scabby from Lacuna
Oh,
Coil.
she's on my list. She's the top on my
So,
list.
I mean,
Yes.
she's phenomenal, but
Right.
again, when Lacuna Coil came out and being in Europe, maybe a little closer to like the European scene before they kind of blew up in North America,
Mhm.
like in the late 90s is when they kind of started becoming something in Europe. Again, I was a 16, 17-year-old kid who had a poster of Christina on my wall,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, of
Which
course.
I also admitted to Christina when I interviewed her now. But those are it's just insane to think when people sometimes ask you like, oh, what's the payoff for you? Like, how much do you monetize your channel and all that kind of good stuff? It's like, well, the most amazing thing is that I get to talk to bands in some cases so often or in such a fun way that people actually become friends, um,
Yes.
and that you can hang out with people that 5 years ago you were reading about in magazines, and not in my wildest dreams would I've thought that I would one day, know them personally or know the inner workings of the industry, which is a cool
Right.
thing.
And now you've got their phone number, and it's insane. And you're like,
Yeah,
you
but the lesson is get the tour manager's phone number. That's much more important.
But I've been through that too. I've been that young, I mean, I started when I was in college doing that sort of thing too, where like I was almost too afraid to call the guy, the
Right.
guitar tech or the tour manager or whoever it was that was fielding those calls while they were on tour. I've been so nervous to even make that phone call, even though I was scheduled for an interview. Like
Right.
it is terrifying. it's not something interviewing is not something everybody can do. I mean, and
For
you,
sure.
in your case, I have to wonder coming from Belgium, coming to Canada from Belgium, was there a language barrier at all for a period of time when you're
Not
learning how to
really, I
communicate with
would
them?
say. I mean, I'm sure that my accent now is less strong than it was, 12 years ago when I came over. But um, I mean, I came over when I was in my late 20s, and in
Mm.
Belgium, my mother tongue is Dutch, but when you grew up speaking Dutch, you have to speak a lot of different languages because otherwise, nobody understands you in the world. So most people that speak Dutch, both like from Belgium, Netherlands, some Scandinavian countries that have similar languages, we all tend to learn a decent amount of English as we grow up because, through entertainment and stuff like that, we don't overdub like French speaking regions or German speaking regions would
Mm.
do. So my English was pretty decent when I came over to Canada, and then I only started doing it. It was like I said, 4 years ago. So at that point, I mean, I've been working also in international companies for my entire career, and which is now almost 20 years. So I'm not the youngest anymore myself.
I get it. I get it. I'm learning that as I just turned 35 about a month ago. So
Yeah,
I'm
there you go. So you're a baby compared to me. So
starting to understand. Well, you were talking about new metal and how like, now you're starting to see kids younger than you adapt to what you was a resurgence for you with power
right.
metal and Hammerfall. I'm looking at the ones that are just getting into new metal now. I'm like, no, 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 that was mine. And
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
now y'all are putting some respect on their name. I love that so much. So your day job or the international companies that you've been working with that you just mentioned a little bit ago, was any of that at all connected to media or journalism? How did you develop the skill to interview at all?
No, but I think real quick, I've always been in technology in big technology companies or sometimes in smaller technology companies, but more from a sales and partnership building capacity. I'm not into coding or anything like that. So in my day job, I usually manage the strategic relationships between large organizations. So I do have some level of um, salesmanship maybe in my blood, but I'm definitely somebody that looks to build connections, right? And
Mm,
I've definitely applied some of my knowledge of building relationships in business world in breaking into bands and getting my first interviews. Like here's a fun, tip for people that want to get started. Um, if you're a nobody and you ask a singer or a guitar player for an interview, you know, they won't care. It's like if you want to start building a relationship with a new company, go to the CEO. They won't have time for you. But if you go to the
mhm.
drummer, who never gets a chance to talk, or the bass player, like they'll be happy to talk to you. So you'll actually, if somebody ever takes the time to go to my very early interviews, you'll see that the very first few ones are not with the singer or like the lead guitar player of a band. They tend to be more with like people that were more open to being contacted. But yeah, no, it's just it I would describe myself as more of an extroverted person than an introverted person, and
That
just
helps.
in dealing with multiple partners and customers day in day out. I think that definitely has something to do with that. But it's interesting that you call that out because here's something that I don't know if a lot of viewers or audience members understand, but it's a really weird industry when you look at the PR cycles of these underground music genres because 99% of people like you and me do this as a glorified hobby.
Hmm.
Like we're not professionals in most cases. Most online interviewers are not, even if they're now associated with a publication. Those are often amateur people, and to throw some stereotypes out there, the average metal head is not always the most socially adept person. That
I
it
get what you
feels the
mean.
most comfortable in talking to people. So I sometimes feel for people that are professional PR people that are working for these teams, for these labels, and their success is often dependent on, a group of amateurs like myself. And
Mm.
that can't always be easy. But yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic I find. But just as you said that you were sometimes too, especially maybe in the early days, a little uh, too worried to make that call, even if you were scheduled. If
Hmm.
you do this stuff a lot, and I mean, since I started, I've done roughly 1,000 interviews. You find out that many of the bands are in the exact same position. Even bands that have been doing this for a long time, very few bands are actually very comfortable talking and opening up about their art. So, that also kind of disarms everything a little bit, knowing that we're all in the same boat.
Right. They're human. You start to find little clues
Exactly.
as you get to know them, you find that they're human and they have interests and hobbies just like you do. They're excited to promote their product. You're just excited to be there. Eventually you come to that conclusion together. I mean, I'm still thrilled anytime somebody wants to give me the time of day, really. And
Hmm.
talking about building rapport and, building trust, that's really the essence of it. That's really how you
Oh
expand. For
yeah.
anybody listening that wants to get into this for the first time, I mean, I have seen that every single time I show up for something and I stay consistent, or if I present a PR company that I'm working with, like with a recap of what I've done, and they know they can count on that every single time I work with one of their artists, that builds trust. And
Oh,
then
for sure.
they're more likely to recommend you to somebody else if somebody else needs something, or they might be just talking casually about, oh, they did a great job. And then someone else could hear that and say, let me try working with that person too. It really is that simple. Just stay consistent and work with integrity and show what you can do.
Yeah.
That's what
I
it boils down to.
I would add be prepared to that. Um,
Yeah.
the it you know show respect to the people that you're talking to, that you have in fact listened to their in this case, like if we're talking about interviewing bands,
Hmm.
that you've listened to their music, that you've thought about that music, that you've got some, that you have more interesting questions than tell me about your band, or what kind of hardships did you have to overcome, like what inspired you in, like those are very, very generic questions, and you see those being reused over and over again. And I've repurposed a few questions in my day. But I do pride myself on having a decent preparation, so that in some cases, this just as well as I do, some of these, especially bigger bands, they have to do 50 of these interviews back to back in one day.
Yeah.
And they know they're going to get the exact same questions in at least 40 out of the 50. So if you do, if you find a different angle, if you find a personal touch, if you see a connection that somebody else doesn't see, it again, it takes down the guard of that person. They will open up, and it just shows that you respect their time as well. So sometimes it happens that you find yourself in a pinch. There's deadlines, what have you. Sometimes
Yep.
I've had it a few times that I had to rush a preparation in a few minutes before I did an interview. But usually I'll make sure that I have at least 30 minutes to an hour to properly prepare for an interview.
Yeah, you just do your best one by one. And I love that you
Exactly.
include your sense of humor in all of it that you do too. You will let your sense of humor show in your interviews. And I've got to wonder, is that difficult whenever you encounter a guest that might be a little bit more reserved and maybe they're not matching that energy?
Sure. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is somebody that, again, going back to not every band or not every band member is the perfect candidate for an interview. Bands that are, especially bands that are getting started and want to, do a good job of this, you need to make sure that whoever's doing the interviews is able to answer a question with more than a few words, right? And because I've had it definitely myself where, I've like, oh yeah, I got 25 minutes to talk to a band. I've got 10 good questions prepared. There's no way we'll get through 10 questions, but I've got 10 good questions. And the person I'm talking to answers every question with yes or no, and all of a sudden you're 5 minutes into the conversation and you've exhausted all your questions. That's a tough
Been
situation.
there.
So you learn over time that in the first, depends also how much time you take before you start recording.
Hmm.
I always have a little bit of a housekeeping chat, just kind of like who I am, where I'm calling them from, asking them to, how do I properly pronounce your name, ask their permission to start recording, all the kind of good stuff. Just a little bit. From just a little bit of banter, you probably already get a sense of how warm is this person, how exhausted is this person, how funny can this person be. But even if you don't know that at the very start, after one or two questions, you probably can, because it's important to figure that out, because you can be, well, you can try to be funny with somebody that you feel will be okay with that. A more, um, you can ask a more, what's the word here? Um, a
Maybe a
little
more
bit more,
poignant question, something a little
maybe.
deeper.
Yeah, exactly. If you feel that somebody's open up for that, or you can even ask a little bit more of a loaded question if you feel like they're open to that. So tomorrow, I mean, not tomorrow for when people are listening to this, because this won't be out tonight. But tomorrow, I've got my interview going live with James Labrie of Dream Theater. Now,
Oh,
obviously,
fun.
my first question wasn't, so hey, how is it with Mike back in the band, and when you know that they had a big
Everybody's
fight,
gonna ask that. Yeah.
right? Yeah, but also, if I want him to give a good answer to that question, I'm gonna have to ask about that at some point. I want to make sure that I get some rapport first, like you said, ease him in, and make sure that he's open to sharing with that. One question that I've reused a few times, and I know that you were asking me about joking, and this is going completely the opposite side, so I do apologize for that.
It's okay.
But one question that I do like to ask lyricists, if the person I'm talking to is either the vocalist or the lyricist,
Mhm.
when a band has allowed themselves, or when a singer has allowed themselves to be extremely vulnerable in their lyrics, and relive some very dark pages. A question I like to ask them, and this is a good question I find, to kind of help open up somebody that maybe is not ready to share exactly what the bad stuff was. I'll ask them, because I don't know if you agree, but I as a listener, I relate a lot more to those songs where I feel like somebody's being very honest with me,
I do
and
too.
you often see those songs become popular with fans. So I'll ask the singer, so what's this now for you, when this song where you really dealt with your demons, and now that song is a hit, and everybody's gonna want to hear you play that song over and over and over again.
Mm,
Is that therapy? Is that every time a little better? Or do you now have to go to that dark, dark place every time you perform it? And you get vastly different answers. And that usually helps, people you don't force them to talk about the actual very personal bad stuff they might not want to share,
right.
but they then can talk about dealing with that in a different way. And so those are just different areas that you could, go into a conversation with somebody. Again, if you feel that in the conversation they've given you the freedom to do that, or they've given you their approval to go there,
Yeah.
because it can lead into a very dark conversation. And I've had a few people cry on my interviews in a good way. But
Yeah. Oh, wow. I don't know how I would react if that happened to me. I don't know if I would know what to do with it. But
you know what? You stay quiet and you let them
yeah,
take their
let him
time.
process.
Yeah.
Makes complete sense. I mean, in the process for you, very simple from what I just heard too. It's really about being very considerate and thoughtful when it comes to how you present those types of questions in the first place. I mean,
Yeah, I'd say
great
so.
great example of what I saw was like there's a question that in the Vicovi interview that you did, I wish that I had asked them, but I didn't because I was a little bit concerned about how I was going to present it.
Sure.
And you asked Jane about potential backlash for the name of the
Right.
album, which for anybody that doesn't know is My God Has Got a Gun. Yeah, that's an attention grabbing album title.
Yes, yes,
That's a very
yes.
attention grabbing album title. And the album kicks ass, by the way, for anybody wondering. It's a great album. But you asked her flat out, like, was there any concern for potential backlash because of that, whether it's from religious groups or whoever, just because
Hmm.
it is somewhat controversial. You said it in a much more eloquent way than I did. In fact, you were just very matter of fact with it. Like,
Right.
hey, there's a chance this could happen. Is that worrisome for you? And she did pause and she did think about it before answering that. And to her, it was for me, it was nice to hear that she didn't regret it. That was
Yeah, yeah,
my favorite takeaway from her response to that. But that's always been a challenge for me is knowing, okay, how far can I push that boundary?
right.
Because I was concerned that I wouldn't execute the right way. You didn't have a concern; you just did it. Like I learned from you that in watching that, seriously, I learned from you that maybe sometimes the best way to handle that situation is just coming from a very matter of fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a key thing here is you want to make sure that your guest feels that you're not here to get a gotcha statement.
Mhm.
Because you know, somebody else could have asked that same question and gotten that same response, and then published that same interview with an attention-grabbing title saying something along the lines of, Vukovi doesn't care about gun violence, or
Right.
something
They
like
could take
that.
it that way. Yeah.
Like you can interpret stuff like that, and I'm always very conscious of not doing that. I've had several of my interviews that were then, that this happens more often now that my channel has grown a bit, that my interview will be taken by the bigger publications and they'll like,
Mm.
put a quote, or they'll like transcribe some part of it. And then that interview gets shared out multiple times. Metal Injection does this all the time. Bravehearts does this all the time. Blabbermouth does this all the time, right? They basically just look at interviews of people like you and me. They barely do their own interviews anymore, and they
Yep.
just look for what can we, make interesting or exciting. And then they'll share that with a title that I'm like, well, I'm glad I didn't put that title on my interview. Because I'm not here to look for the sensation, and I mean it's fun when one of your interviews goes viral. I'm not gonna lie, like and viral, let's not kid ourselves. Like I don't have any videos that has 12 million views. My most watched video is an interview with Creed, and that was 120,000 views.
Wow.
But still, for rock and metal interviews, that's a lot.
Yes.
So it's fun when that happens, but I want to make sure it doesn't happen for the wrong reasons because yeah, in the short term you can get like a lot of views, but that band will never work with you again. That PR team will likely never work with you again. That label will probably never work with you again. So I want to be conscious of that. And yeah, and the way that you ask these questions in a matter of fact way, but also without, putting any judgment or blame maybe
Hmm.
on that load that into the question. Like um, yesterday, I think I published an interview with Thunder Mother, an all-female Swedish hard rock band,
Mm.
and um, the main lady of the band was the one that I interviewed. Now she's twice in a span of a few years has had a full lineup quit. And the previous time, or the last time it happened, sorry, the all three other band members then started a band called the Gems, and they've got their album out now. And I interviewed them first, and they were very, they were not mincing words about how terrible it was to be in Thunder Mother and having no input and all that kind of stuff. So when
Mm.
I'm talking to Thunder Mother and talking to Philippa, the guitar player, the original guitar player, I
Mhm.
could ask a very loaded question about that. Instead, I'll ask her, or I did ask her, hey, this happened twice. You're working with different musicians now. What are the lessons you learned from those
Yeah.
previous episodes, and are you doing things different now? That doesn't that's not saying you're a horrible person and nobody wants to work with you, but it's all still acknowledging like, hey, this happened, and people want to know why this happened and what's going on. And so yeah, so I find that if as long as you show that you're willing to ask a non-judgmental question, is that a right thing to say? I don't know. And after the fact, you're not turning their words into clickbait.
Hmm.
I think that just builds your integrity, right?
Yeah. That's that. It's really that simple. Just be careful and be thoughtful about what it is that you're doing. In all
Exactly.
of the folks that you've interviewed, I mean, you've interviewed a wide variety of people. What has that taught you about people in general?
Well, it's a- something I've taught about myself is that I need to listen more in life.
Mm.
So I I think being an interviewer makes me a better person. As you can tell, I'm not afraid to talk. I talk a lot. In my personal life, in my professional life, I talk a lot. And somebody that talks a lot is not a good interviewer because you have to listen very carefully to what people say. And based on what they say, you can then build on top of that. You know, you don't just want to go through the list of, you can have questions prepared, obviously, and you want to go back to those questions. But if somebody says something interesting, you want to make sure to build on that. And learning to listen better is a good skill to have, especially for people like myself. So that is a takeaway that I've learned. And I think a second thing is uh, it's doing this has opened me up to so much music. I thought I knew a lot of bands before I started this. I
Mm.
thought I knew a lot of music before I started this. But there's so like I discover new. I mean, you notice probably as well that every Friday there's at least 100 new albums, right?
Oh yeah.
And that's just the labels that we work with. So there's so much out there, and you learn a lot. And even if some stuff is not necessarily my taste, that doesn't mean that there isn't a really interesting story behind the music or the person that does it.
Yes.
I've interviewed bands whose music I think is absolutely atrocious. And no, I won't share who. Um, but I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I definitely was able to by first preparing for the interview, so really listening to the lyrics and listening to the music and what have you, that already gives me some level of appreciation for it. But actually having the conversation, again, I might still not be the fan of that music and I might never play the music, but um, doesn't mean that there isn't something really interesting to find out behind that. And that's something that I think most of us don't really take time for in our lives. You know, we live in a world where if I don't like something very quickly, then I move on.
Hmm.
And I think it's everybody has an interesting story to tell. And sometimes they need a little bit more help from you to tell it. Sometimes they're ready to go, but it's worth the effort.
I love hearing that. What's next for you? What can we look forward to coming from you? I mean, we got some hints in the Christina video on the way, but is there anything else that you're excited about?
I mean, all the time. I mean, there's my calendar is pretty insane right now. The I wish I had more time for doing different stuff still. It's impossible because there's so many bands to interview and it's hard to say no. So I've got a couple of high profile bands coming out for sure. So interviews, well, tomorrow this will already be out when people listen to this. But yeah, Dream Theater is coming, Arch Enemy is coming, Lacuna Coil is coming, Killswitch Engage is coming, all those cool stuff. But there's a lot of cool smaller bands as well that I'm supporting. I'm looking forward to doing after the holidays was a little bit quieter, but going out to more shows again because going to shows usually means for me an in-person interview as well, which I always find a lot of fun. They tend to be much
Yeah.
shorter, but they're a lot of fun. And some live show reports is fun to do as well. I'm looking forward to the festival season starting, and I'm a lot of information still has to get out there, but I'm sponsoring the special festival that's coming in August in the States to raise awareness and funds for women's shelters, which is really cool. So the Femme Fatale festival is going to happen, and just being part of that is really cool. And I finally have a platform that's big enough to get some awareness to some smaller bands and smaller movements, and being part of that is really, really cool. So yeah, keep your eyes open for a ton more interviews and uh, more and more live show reports as we go.
Nice. And where in the States is the Femme Fatale Festival?
I actually don't
Do you
know
remember?
yet. It's
Oh, okay.
I've agreed to sponsoring it, and I will support the bands that will. So all the bands that are playing or that will play need to have at least one female member in it. But it's really to it's a charity event to raise money for women shelters all over the U.S. So stay tuned. More of that information is going to come by. Probably by the time this conversation goes live, there will be a ton of information out there.
There'll be something. Okay, we'll keep
Yeah,
our
yeah,
eyes
yeah.
and ears peeled. Jasper, thank you for your nuggets of wisdom this episode. Thank you for the encouragement. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. My pleasure.